don't even know where to begin with this. I'm not the type of person who usually posts on Reddit, but after what happened to me, I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there will believe me, or at least think twice before doing something stupid like I did. So I'm a pretty normal guy in my early 20s. I spend too much time online scrolling through Reddit, YouTube, and lately TikTok. You know, the usual. One night I was on this deep dive binge, watching urban exploration videos. You know the kind, people sneaking into abandoned hospitals, old theme parks, and places they're definitely not supposed to be in. It's fun to watch, but I never thought of doing it myself. Too risky, right? But then I stumbled onto something that changed everything. Someone in the comments of a random Urbex video mentioned exploring dark web locations. At first, I thought it was a joke, like, what the hell does that even mean? But curiosity got the better of me. I started searching around and found these threads on niche forums talking about it. People were saying there are coordinates you can find on the dark web that lead to insane, abandoned places that aren't on any map. Places with no history, no record, like they just popped up out of nowhere. It sounded sketchy as hell, but that was kind of the appeal, you know? After a couple of days of digging, I found a subreddit where people shared their dark web urbex experiences. Most of the posts were vague, like, found this place in the middle of the woods, super creepy vibes. But then I found one that stood out. This guy posted pictures of what looked like an old factory, but something was off. The walls were covered in graffiti that didn't even look like letters, more like symbols. The machinery inside was all rusted and broken, but some of it looked fresh, like it had been used recently. The kicker? In one of the photos, there was a dirty mattress in the corner with what looked like bloodstains. I was hooked. The guy who posted the thread said he found the coordinates on the dark web, but he refused to share the link. He said it was too dangerous and warned people not to go looking for it. Classic internet reverse psychology, right? So, of course, I kept digging. Eventually, I found someone in the comments who DM'd me a link. I didn't think twice before clicking it. The site was bare bones, just black text on a white background. There was a list of coordinates with vague descriptions next to them, stuff like forest clearing, northeast, warehouse, 14B, and clinic, southwest. Some of them had warnings like do not enter or for experienced only, but that just made it more intriguing. I screenshotted a few of the coordinates and sent them to my friend Nate. Nate's my ride or die. We've been through a lot together, and he's the type of guy who never says no to anything. When I told him what I found, he was immediately on board. Dude, this is going to be insane, he said, like real-life horror movie shit. We'll film it, post it on TikTok and go viral. We planned it out for a Friday night. We'd pick a spot that wasn't too far from where we lived, just to test the waters. One of the coordinates led to what was described as a storage facility, about an hour outside of town. We figured it was abandoned, maybe a place where someone had stored stolen goods or something. The adrenaline rush was kicking in before we even got in the car. When Friday night rolled around, Nate showed up at my place with his beat-up Honda Civic and a bag full of snacks and flashlights. We packed a few other essentials, our phones, a crowbar, just in case, and a cheap GoPro we borrowed from another friend. I told my mum we were just going out to see a late movie, and we hit the road. The drive was uneventful at first, just the two of us hyping each other up. But as we got closer to the location, the vibe started to shift. We were heading out into the middle of nowhere, and the GPS signal started cutting out. Nate joked about how this was probably the start of every horror movie ever, and we laughed it off, but I couldn't shake this weird feeling in my gut. Eventually, we reached the turnoff. It was a narrow dirt road surrounded by trees on both sides. There were no street lights, no signs, nothing. Just pitch black darkness. We kept driving until we saw it, a chain link fence with a padlocked gate. The fence was rusted and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Beyond it, we could see the outline of a building. It was huge, way bigger than I expected. "Looks abandoned enough," Nate said as he grabbed the crowbar. We climbed over the fence and started towards the building. The closer we got, the more I noticed how weird it was. There were no signs or logos, nothing to indicate what this place had been. Just a massive rectangular structure with boarded-up windows and a few doors. We found a side door that had been pried open before, so we slipped inside. The air was thick and musty, like it hadn't been ventilated in years. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, but we could make out rows of shelves like the kind you'd see in a warehouse. Most of them were empty, but some had random junk on them. Old tools, dusty boxes, even a few mannequin parts. That was the first red flag. "Who the hell leaves mannequins in a place like this?" I whispered. Nate shrugged. "Probably some old factory or storage place. Chill out, man." We kept walking, our footsteps echoing through the building. The deeper we went, the stranger it got. There were more mannequins, but they weren't just lying around anymore. Some of them were standing up, posed in weird positions. One of them was missing an arm, and another had its head twisted all the way around. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just vandals messing around, but Nate looked uneasy too. Then we found the room. It was near the back of the building, behind a heavy metal door that was slightly ajar. Inside, there was a single chair bolted to the floor and chains hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. I felt my stomach drop. "Dude, let's get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But Nate wasn't listening. He was shining his flashlight at the corner of the room, where there was a small table covered in what looked like tools. At first, I thought they were just rusted old junk, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't tools at all. They were surgical instruments, scalpels, clamps, and other things I couldn't even identify. Some of them were clean, but others had dried blood on them. That's when we heard it. It wasn't a sound, no footsteps or voices. It was a sensation, like someone was watching us. I spun around, shining my flashlight at the doorway, but it was empty. "Nate, we need to go now," I said. He nodded, for once not arguing, and we started back the way we came. But as we moved through the building, I started to notice something. The mannequins. They weren't where we left them. Some of them were in different positions and others were gone entirely. My heart was pounding as we reached the door we came in through. But when we pushed it open, we froze. There was a van parked outside. It was an old, beat-up, white van with no windows, just sitting there with its headlights off. My blood ran cold. Nate grabbed my arm, his face pale. "Dude, someone's here," he whispered. We ducked back inside, trying to figure out what to do. That's when we heard the first sound, a heavy metallic clang, like someone slamming a door shut. It came from somewhere deeper in the building. Then another sound, closer this time, footsteps. They weren't hurried or frantic, just slow and deliberate, like whoever it was knew exactly where we were. And that's when I realized we weren't alone. I can't even explain the kind of fear that gripped me at that moment. You know when you're a kid and you wake up in the middle of the night thinking you saw something in your room and your brain goes into overdrive trying to rationalize it? It was like that, but 1,000 times worse. This wasn't my imagination. There was someone or something inside the building with us. And then there was the van outside. My breathing felt loud as hell in the silence. I tried to calm myself down, but it wasn't working. Nate was crouched next to me, gripping the crowbar like it was a lifeline. His eyes were darting between the door we came through and the hallway where we'd heard the footsteps. "Bro," he whispered, barely audible. "Do you think they saw us?" I don't know, I whispered back. Maybe it's just someone exploring like us. I didn't believe my own words. Who the hell brings a van to an abandoned building at 2 a.m. just to explore? This was planned. They knew this place. And we were on their turf. Nate pulled out his phone and started typing something, his hands shaking so bad he kept hitting the wrong keys. I realized he was trying to call for help, but when he held the screen up, it showed no signal. Of course, we were too far out for service. Let's just make a run for it, he said, his voice trembling. We go out the same way we came in, hop the fence and book it. They can't catch us both. I nodded, even though I knew how stupid it sounded. We didn't even know how many of them there were, or if they were armed. But what choice did we have? Waiting around felt like suicide. We crept back towards the door, moving as quietly as we could. Every step felt like it echoed through the whole building. The sound of our sneakers scraping against the concrete was unbearable. When we reached the door, Nate peered out first. The van was still there, but now the driver's side door was open. I didn't see anyone, but that didn't mean much. "Go," Nate whispered, shoving me forward. We slipped outside and started running toward the fence. The adrenaline was so strong I barely noticed the barbed wire scraping my hands as I climbed over. I hit the ground on the other side and turned to help Nate. He was halfway over when the beam of a flashlight hit us. "Hey!" a deep, angry voice yelled. I froze. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw him, a man stepping out from behind the van, holding what looked like a long pipe or a crowbar. He wasn't alone. Two other guys came around the side of the building, one of them holding a flashlight, and the other carrying, I don't even know what. It looked like some kind of tool or weapon, like a baton with jagged edges. They didn't look like cops or security guards. They looked like trouble. "Run!" Nate screamed, finally jumping down from the fence. We took off into the woods, branches slapping against our faces and tearing at our clothes. I could hear them behind us, their heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. They weren't shouting or yelling anymore, which made it worse. They were quiet, like predators hunting their prey. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like forever. My lungs were on fire, and my legs were screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't, not when I could still hear them behind us. Nate was ahead of me, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he pushed through the trees. I didn't dare turn mine on. It felt like painting a target on my back. Finally, we reached a clearing. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Nate crouched beside me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Do you think we lost them?" I managed to choke out. "I don't know," he said, glancing nervously at the tree line. "But we can't stay here. We need to find a road or something." He was right, but I couldn't move yet. My whole body felt like it was shutting down. That's when I noticed something on Nate's arm, a deep gash running from his wrist to his elbow. The barbed wire must have cut him worse than we thought. "Dude, your arm," I said. He looked down and swore under his breath. "It's fine, just a scratch." It wasn't fine. Blood was dripping onto the ground, and I could tell he was trying to act tough, but he was shaking. We didn't have anything to wrap it with, so I tore the sleeve off my shirt and tied it around his arm as tight as I could. Then we heard it again, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and way too close. I whipped my head around, scanning the tree line. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was unmistakable. They'd found us. Nate grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. "Come on, man, we gotta go." We started running again, deeper into the woods. The trees were so thick that we could barely see where we were going, and I kept tripping over roots and rocks. At one point I fell hard and scraped my knee, but Nate yanked me up before I could even process the pain. Then we saw it, a faint light in the distance. It looked like a street light, maybe a road. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The footsteps were louder now, and I could hear voices, low and guttural, like they were whispering to each other. They weren't just following us, they were herding us. When we broke through the trees, I realized we hadn't found a road. It was another building, smaller than the first one, but just as abandoned looking. The light we'd seen was coming from a single bulb hanging above the door, flickering like it was about to burn out. "We can't go in there," I said, my voice shaking. Nate didn't respond. He just grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. I wanted to argue, but the footsteps were so close now I could feel the vibrations in the ground. We didn't have a choice. The door wasn't locked. We slipped inside and immediately pressed our backs against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The air inside was even worse than the first building, thick, damp, and reeking of something metallic, like rust or blood. My flashlight flickered as I looked around. The room we were in was small and empty, with peeling paint and a single door on the far wall. Nate was clutching his crowbar, his knuckles white. "They'll see us if we stay here," he whispered. "We have to go deeper." "Deeper into what?" I hissed. "We don't even know what this place is." "Do you want to go back out there?" he snapped. I didn't. So we moved toward the door, every step feeling like it might be our last. The hallway beyond was long and narrow, lined with more doors. Some were open, revealing empty rooms, while others were closed and padlocked. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. "What the hell is that smell?" Nate whispered. I didn't answer because I already had a pretty good idea. It smelled like death. Then we heard it again. Footsteps, this time inside the building. They weren't coming from behind us, they were coming from ahead. And that's when I realized whoever or whatever was chasing us had already been here. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of those footsteps echoing in the hallway. They weren't rushed, like someone chasing us in a panic. They were calm, methodical, like whoever was making them knew exactly what they were doing. Like they had all the time in the world, and we didn't. Nate and I froze in place, our flashlights trembling in our hands. The air was thick, and I felt like I was breathing in pure adrenaline. My legs were screaming at me to run, but my brain couldn't decide which direction was worse. Back into the woods, where those guys might still be waiting, or deeper into this godforsaken building where the footsteps were coming from. Nate made the decision for both of us. He grabbed my arm and yanked me toward one of the open doors. The room inside was small, with crumbling walls and a pile of rusted metal in the corner. It smelled even worse in there, like mildew and rot, but it was somewhere to hide. We crouched behind the pile, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. I could hear Nate's breathing, sharp and uneven, and I was sure whoever was out there would hear it too. The footsteps got louder. They were coming down the hallway now, slow and deliberate, pausing every few steps. I imagined someone peering into every room, checking for movement. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but there was nothing. We were cornered. Then the footsteps stopped. They were right outside the door. I don't know how I didn't piss myself right then and there. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stifle the sound of my breathing. Nate was gripping the crowbar so tight his knuckles looked like they were about to pop out of his skin. We both stared at the doorway, waiting for whoever, or whatever it was, to come inside. But they didn't. Instead, we heard something worse, a sound that didn't make sense. It was this low, wet gurgling, like someone choking on their own spit. It didn't sound human. I glanced at Nate, and his eyes were wide with terror. He shook his head, silently mouthing, "What the fuck?" The sound moved past the door, heading further down the hallway. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't normal. It wasn't just some random group of guys messing with us. It felt wrong. After what felt like an eternity, Nate whispered, "We need to get out of here." "No shit," I hissed back. "But how?" He peeked around the corner of the door, his movements slow and deliberate. When he turned back to me, he nodded. "Hallway's clear, let's go." We crept out of the room, moving as quietly as we could. The hallway stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb at the far end. I couldn't tell where the footsteps had gone, and that made it worse. The silence was deafening, every tiny sound we made echoing like a gunshot. "Which way?" I whispered. Nate pointed toward the flickering light. "That has to lead to an exit." It didn't. The hallway opened up into a larger room, and the moment we stepped inside, I knew we'd made a mistake. The smell hit me like a freight train, pungent and metallic, so strong it made my eyes water. The room was lit by a few hanging bulbs casting an eerie yellow glow over everything. And that's when I saw it. The walls were covered in hooks, rows and rows of meat hooks, most of them empty, but some weren't. Hanging from a few of them were what looked like animal carcasses, but they were too big, too wrong. I couldn't make out exactly what they were, and part of me didn't want to. One of the hooks had something smaller hanging from it, a doll, or at least I thought it was a doll. Its head was twisted at an unnatural angle, and its body was covered in what looked like dried blood. I gagged, turning away, but Nate grabbed my arm. "Dude," he whispered, pointing to the far corner of the room. That's when I saw it. There was a table in the corner, and on it was what looked like a camera setup, a tripod, a light, and a microphone, all aimed at the center of the room. There were dried stains on the floor below it, dark, almost black, and I didn't need to be a detective to figure out what they were. "This isn't just some abandoned building," Nate said, his voice shaking. This is a fucking snuff house." I wanted to throw up. My legs felt like they were going to give out. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. All those stories about the dark web, the videos people whispered about but never actually watched. It was real, and we were standing in the middle of it. "Let's go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Now." We turned to leave, but before we could take a step, the door slammed shut behind us. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there, at least no one I could see. The room was silent, but I could feel it. That same sensation from before, like we were being watched. I shined my flashlight at the door, trying to figure out what had closed it, but there was nothing. No wind, no mechanism, just nothing. Nate didn't waste any time. He ran to the door and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he hissed, pulling harder. "From the outside?" I asked, my voice rising. "Who the fuck cares? Help me!" I ran over and tried to help him, but it was no use. The door wouldn't move. That's when I heard it again, that wet, gurgling sound coming from somewhere in the room. I froze, my hands still on the door handle. Nate heard it too. He stopped pulling and turned to face the room, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered. The sound was coming from one of the far corners near the meat hooks. Slowly, I turned my flashlight in that direction. At first, I didn't see anything, just the hooks swaying slightly in the still air. But then I saw it. There was something crouched in the shadows just beyond the reach of the light. It was hunched over, its body twitching and convulsing like it was having a seizure. I couldn't make out any details, but the outline was enough to make my blood run cold. It looked wrong. Too long, too thin, Its limbs didn't move like they should, bending at odd angles as it twitched. "Nate," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We need to—" Before I could finish, it moved. It didn't walk or run. It skittered like a spider, its limbs clicking against the floor as it shot toward us. Nate screamed, swinging the crowbar wildly, but the thing stopped just short of the light, retreating back into the shadows. I don't know what was worse, seeing it move or realizing it was toying with us. "What the fuck is that?" Nate yelled, his voice cracking.
"I don't know," I shouted back, backing up against the wall. My flashlight was shaking so bad I could barely hold on to it. The thing let out another gurgling noise, this time louder, and I realized it wasn't alone. More of them were emerging from the shadows, their twisted, jerking movements making my skin crawl. They circled the edge of the room, staying just out of the light, like they were waiting for something. And then the light started to flicker. The light's flickering wasn't just terrifying, it was pure panic-inducing. You know that kind of fear where your brain is screaming at you to do something, but your body feels like it's made of cement. That's where I was, frozen, staring at these twisted things that barely looked human as they circled us in the shadows. Every time the bulb above us flickered, they got closer, like they knew exactly when to move, and I swear to God they weren't just circling, they were playing with us. Nate wasn't handling it any better. He was swinging the crowbar at nothing, just flailing it around like it was going to magically keep them away. I could hear him muttering under his breath, something about "we're fucked," over and over like a broken record. He wasn't wrong. Then the light went out completely. For a second I thought I'd gone blind. The room plunged into absolute darkness, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I could hear them now, moving closer, their clicking limbs scraping against the concrete. I fumbled with my flashlight, desperate to turn it back on, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. When I finally managed to flip the switch, the beam of light cut through the dark and landed right on one of them.
It was the first time I'd gotten a good look at one of these things, and I wish I hadn't. Its body was emaciated, like it hadn't eaten in years. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, stretched tightly over its bones. But its face, that's what made me want to throw up. It didn't have eyes, just deep, empty sockets that seemed to follow me anyway. Its mouth was too wide, with jagged teeth that didn't even look like they belonged in a human skull. It wasn't just a thing, it was a fucking nightmare. And it was smiling. The flashlight beam hit it, and it froze, cocking its head to the side like it was curious. Then it lunged. "Move!" I screamed, diving out of the way as it crashed into the wall where I'd been standing. Nate swung the crowbar at it, landing a solid hit that made a sickening crunch. The thing let out a shriek that didn't sound like anything I've ever heard, like metal scraping against glass, and skittered back into the shadows. But it wasn't alone. The others were closing in now, their movements faster, more deliberate. "Nate, we need to find another way out," I yelled, shining my flashlight around the room. "There isn't another way," he shouted back, swinging the crowbar at another one of them as it got too close. I scanned the room, my flashlight shaking as I tried to focus on anything that looked like an escape. That's when I noticed something. One of the walls had a vent near the floor, just big enough for us to crawl through. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying here. "There," I yelled, pointing at the vent. Nate hesitated for a second, glancing at the vent, and then back at the things creeping closer. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. "Do you have a better idea?" I snapped. He didn't. We both bolted for the vent, but the moment we started moving, the creatures went berserk. They shrieked, their movements frantic as they lunged at us from all directions. One of them grabbed at my leg, its claw-like fingers digging into my jeans. I kicked as hard as I could, feeling something snap as it let go and tumbled backward. Nate reached the vent first, dropping to his knees and yanking the cover off. "Hurry up!" he yelled, tossing the crowbar inside before crawling in himself. I wasn't far behind, but one of the creatures was faster. It grabbed my shoulder, its grip like a vice, and I felt its claws start to dig into my skin. I screamed, twisting and swinging the flashlight at it as hard as I could. The beam caught its face and it shrieked again, releasing me just long enough for me to dive into the vent. Nate was already ahead of me, crawling as fast as he could. The vent was cramped and filthy, the metal scraping against my knees and elbows as I moved. Behind us, I could hear the creatures clawing at the opening, their shrieks echoing through the narrow space. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. "Where the fuck does this go?" Nate yelled, his voice echoing in the vent. "I don't know," I shouted back. "Just keep moving." The vent seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make any sense. The air was stale and suffocating, and the further we went, the hotter it got. I was starting to think we'd just crawled into another trap when I saw a faint light up ahead. "There!" I yelled, my voice cracking. Nate reached the light first, pushing against what looked like another vent cover. It wouldn't budge. "Fuck!" he shouted, slamming his shoulder into it. I crawled up beside him, shoving against the cover with everything I had. It felt like it was welded shut, but finally, with one last, desperate push, it popped open. We spilled out onto the floor, gasping for air, and scrambled to our feet. We were in another room, but this one was different. It was smaller, almost like an office, with a desk and a chair shoved against the wall. The walls were lined with shelves filled with boxes, jars, and things I didn't want to look at too closely. The light was coming from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. And then I saw it. On the desk was a laptop, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. But it wasn't just any laptop. It was open to a live feed. The screen showed the room we'd just come from, the one with the hooks. The creatures were still there, skittering around and shrieking at each other. But they weren't alone. There was someone else in the room now, a man wearing a dirty hoodie and jeans, standing perfectly still in the center of the chaos. He didn't look afraid. If anything, he looked calm, like he was in control. "Is that one of them?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said, my stomach twisting into knots. "He's human." As we watched, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and shiny, a remote. He pressed a button, and the creatures stopped moving. Just like that. One by one, they turned to face the camera, their eyeless sockets staring straight at us through the screen. The man smiled. Then the laptop screen went black. "What the fuck just happened?" Nate whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could answer, the door to the room slammed shut. The sound of the door slamming behind us was like a gunshot. My head whipped around, and I felt my stomach drop. There wasn't anyone there, at least not that I could see. But I knew we weren't alone. Nate and I just stared at each other for a second, both of us frozen, neither of us saying a word. It felt like we were waiting for something to happen, and deep down I think we both knew that whatever came next was going to be bad. The laptop on the desk buzzed back to life. The screen was no longer showing the room with the hooks. Instead, it showed us. A live feed of the very room we were standing in, the camera angle slightly tilted like it was hidden in one of the corners. I felt my knees go weak. We weren't just being chased, we were being watched the whole time. Whoever this guy was, he had been following every move we made. Nate slammed his hand down on the laptop, snapping the screen shut. "Fuck this," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "Fuck this, fuck this, fuck this." What the fuck is happening, man? Before I could answer, the light bulb overhead flickered again. This time, it didn't come back on. The room plunged into darkness, and we were left with only the faint beam of my flashlight. I swung it around wildly, trying to illuminate every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift with the movement, like they were alive. And then we heard it. A voice. It was low and gravelly, like someone who'd been smoking 3 packs a day for their entire life. But it wasn't just that. It was calm. Too calm. "Are you enjoying yourselves?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. Nate gripped the crowbar tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Who the fuck are you?" he shouted, spinning around. The voice chuckled. It wasn't the kind of laugh you hear when someone's telling a joke. It was slow and deliberate, like they were savoring the sound of their own amusement. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. "This place, it doesn't like visitors." "What are you talking about?" I stammered, my voice cracking. "What is this place, and what the fuck do you want from us?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the door at the far end of the room creaked open. My flashlight caught the edge of it, swinging slowly inward, revealing a pitch-black hallway beyond. The air coming from the hallway was different, thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on us. "Run," the voice said, almost gleefully. "I want to see how far you make it." That was it for me. I grabbed Nate's arm and bolted toward the open door, dragging him with me. I didn't care where the hallway led. I just needed to get the hell out of that room. The sound of that voice was still ringing in my ears, and I swear I could hear faint laughter following us as we ran. The hallway wasn't like the rest of the building. The walls were different, cleaner, almost sterile, like we'd stepped into some kind of hospital or lab. The floor was smooth concrete, and the overhead lights were dim but steady, casting a sickly yellow glow over everything. There were doors on either side, all of them closed, with small windows that were covered in grime. I didn't want to know what was behind them. As we ran, I started to notice something. The hallway wasn't straight. It twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, doubling back on itself, leading us in circles. My breathing was ragged, and my legs were screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. Every time we turned a corner, I expected to see something. Those creatures, or the man in the hoodie, or something worse. But there was nothing, just the endless, winding hallway. This isn't right," Nate panted, slowing to a stop. He was bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. "We've been running forever. We should have hit a wall or something by now." I stopped, too, leaning against the wall, trying to catch my breath. He was right. The building wasn't this big. It couldn't be. But there we were, stuck in some kind of impossible maze. We have to keep going," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't stop. We'll find a way out. We have to." Before Nate could respond, the lights above us started to buzz. It was a low, electrical hum at first, but it quickly grew louder, almost deafening. The bulbs began to flicker, casting the hallway into a strobe-like nightmare. And then they went out. Total darkness. I turned my flashlight back on, but it barely cut through the gloom. Nate was standing next to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. That's when we heard it again. The clicking. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere far down the hallway, but it was getting louder, closer. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw them. The creatures. They were crawling out of the darkness, their limbs jerking and twisting unnaturally as they moved toward us. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Nate and pulling him along with me. We sprinted down the hallway, the clicking and scraping growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel them. their presence pressing down on me like a weight. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the doors blurring together as we ran. And then we saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, with faint light spilling out from the other side. It felt like salvation. We ran for it, pushing our bodies to the limit. Nate reached it first, slamming it open and diving through. I followed, slamming it shut behind us and collapsing against it, gasping for air. The room we were in was different. It wasn't abandoned or decayed like the rest of the building. It was pristine, almost clinical, with white walls and fluorescent lights that hummed softly. In the center of the room was a single chair bolted to the floor, and sitting in the chair was the man in the hoodie. He smiled. "Congratulations," he said, his voice calm and smooth. "You made it." What the fuck do you want from us?" Nate stammered, gripping the crowbar like it was the only thing keeping him alive. The man tilted his head, his smile widening. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's about what they want." As he spoke, the walls of the room began to shift. Panels slid open, revealing glass windows that looked out into the hallway we'd just come from. The creatures were there, pressed up against the glass, their eyeless faces staring at us, their mouths twitching in anticipation. "They like to play," the man said, standing up and walking toward us. "And you too?" "You've been the most fun they've had in a long time." I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't work. Nate raised the crowbar, but before he could swing it, the man snapped his fingers. The lights went out and the room was plunged into darkness. The last thing I heard was Nate screaming. And then, nothing.